John, you spent many years travelling in Eastern Europe and Russia as well.
That's right.
Can I ask why you did that? Where did it all begin for you?
Reading one's own motives is quite difficult actually, but looking back I think it really began in Cambridge as a student when I was asked early on, I think the first week actually, do you believe in God? And the person that asked the question then said, oh sorry, you're Irish. They all believe in God over there and they fight about it. And I'd heard the question before, but somehow it struck me that if I was going to hold my head up intellectually, respectably in Cambridge, I had to really answer the question, was my faith in God simply a product of Irish genetics and environment and so on? So what I decided to do was, here's a great opportunity to get to know people that don't share my worldview. So I looked around the room and I thought an atheist would probably be somebody with a beard. And I befriended a chap with a beard, and sure enough, he was an atheist. Of course, I've since learned that not all people with beards are atheists. Some of the most delightful people you can meet have beards. But that started a lifelong interest in really finding out what it was like, not simply to be an atheist, but to be systematically exposed to atheism in the education system and so on. And I got the opportunity to work in Germany as an Alexander von Humboldt fellow, learnt German, and was invited to Eastern Europe, and then discovered that German was a lingua franca, and it went on from there.
What were your initial impressions of communist Europe?
Well, they were very varied, of course, because communism affected the countries very differently. I mean, the East Germans regarded Hungary a little bit like paradise if they got the chance to go out, because there was much more pressure in East Germany. For example, young people who said that they were Christian and were not prepared to swear public allegiance to the atheistic state couldn't be educated beyond the age of 13. That was never true in Hungary. So you get people who were Christians going to university in Hungary, whereas that was very rare in the German Democratic Republic.
I wanted to ask you, how was atheism enforced in communist countries?
Well, it was enforced is perhaps too strong a word. It's an essential part of Marxist philosophy. That's sometimes not realized in the West. For Marx, the fundamental criticism was the criticism of religion, so that parents were free to teach their children atheism. Atheism was taught as a compulsory subject in most schools. But if parents started teaching their children Christianity, that could lead to difficulties, particularly in Russia. But discrimination could be applied subtly. Not so subtly was the refusal of education to people beyond 13 in East Germany. But I met many people who would encounter chicanery in their jobs, and it would be made difficult and so on. They'd not really get the job. And it would be very difficult for them to put their fingers on it and say, look, this is actual discrimination because of faith. But that's what it appeared to be.
Presumably you met people of faith amidst
that
atheistic culture.
Oh, very, very much so. And very courageous people, thoughtful, intelligent people. And I went there, one of the reasons I went was to encourage them, because I held a job in the West that by definition was impossible for a Christian to hold in many of these countries in the East.
Did you find though that the atheist elite were interested in the God question nonetheless? Maybe offline even? A private conversation here?
I found that increasingly, of course, as the years went on in my contacts within the academies of science, they were interested, very interested offline. Because for me, particularly when I started going to Russia, I was just an enigma to them. Because within their categories of thinking, a person who was an academic could not possibly believe in God, because the two were totally incompatible. So I found in the early days of going to Russia, which started 1989, that that's all they were interested in. Even in mathematics seminars, I'd give a seminar and I'd answer questions and be very polite and interested and so on. And then they said, can we ask some other questions? And inevitably the first question would be, we hear you believe in God, why? And then we'd have a very interesting discussion.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn died just recently.
Yes.
He said that Russia bore the consequences of rejecting God. What were those consequences?
Well, I've had it put to me on more than one occasion by Russian intellectuals like this. We thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We were wrong. We got rid of God and we devalued humanity. Now that's a very interesting thing, I think, and many Russians would regard Dostoevsky as a kind of prophet. In The Brothers Karamazov, where he said, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. And they would say he was exactly right, because morality disintegrated and power determined what was to be believed.
Why do you think the communist regime was unable to crush belief, ultimately?
Because you can't, in the end, conquer truth by power. And therefore, people who are convinced in their heart of truth and realize what's happening to them, that they're being browbeaten, I think there's a resilience in the human spirit that wants to see truth told. And that's not only true of religious belief, of course. What was going on in the Gulag was something that people wanted the world to know, every bit as much as the Jewish people who suffered in Auschwitz wanted the world to know what the truth was about what's going on.
Can Christianity be public in Russia today, or is there a residual anti-religion sentiment?
Oh, there'll be a residual anti-religion sentiment for a long time, but of course there's been a resurgence of identifying Russia with Mother Church and Orthodoxy and so on. Now, how deep that goes, I'm not really in a position to assess, but churches are thriving and people can publicly profess their faith and they can talk about it, although we begin to hear of difficulties caused by local police and local authorities. I haven't been in Russia now for a few years. I've tended to be in the Ukraine, where there's a very positive interest in the Christian faith, and many schools, for example.
Well, you have a textbook,
yes,
am I right?
That's right.
On worldviews and
I've
Christianity.
been involved in writing with my colleague, Professor David Gooding, a textbook on worldviews that's used, and there are courses on Christian ethics in schools, not simply on ethics, but on Christian ethics that have been encouraged by the government, because they have seen, what is obvious of course, that communism left a colossal moral vacuum, and they're very concerned about it among their young people with all the problems of drugs and everything else that they're getting.
Thank you very much.
Not at all.